The night all of Egypt cried. The final plague explained. In the grand tapestry of human history, there are threads that shimmer with a power beyond mortal comprehension. These are the stories of empires that touched the heavens, of kings who declared themselves gods, and of forces that rose from the dust to challenge them. They are tales of clashing civilizations, not merely of men and armies, but of faiths and pantheons, of order and chaos, of freedom and bondage. Welcome to the Eldritch Codex. Today we journey back more than 3 millennia, to a time when the world was forged in the crucible of myth and might. We travel to the land of the pharaohs, to an empire whose monuments still defy the ages, Egypt. But we are not here to marvel at the gold of its tombs or the perfection of its pyramids. We are here to witness the beginning of its unraveling. This is the story of the 10 plagues of Egypt, a story of divine judgment so profound, so terrifying, that it has echoed through the corridors of time, a cornerstone of faith for millions and a subject of fascination for all. And it begins not with a whisper but with a roar. It begins with the lifeblood of the empire turning to poison before its very eyes. This is the tale of the first plague, the first terrible warning. This is the story of the Nile of Blood. Part 1. The Nile of Blood, a god's first warning. To understand the sheer magnitude of the cataclysm that was to come, to grasp why the first plague was not merely a tragedy but a declaration of total war, we must first immerse ourselves in the world it sought to break. We must understand the kingdom it targeted, a civilization that saw itself not as one nation among many, but as the center of the created order. We must enter the golden cage of New Kingdom Egypt. Picture the world around the 13th century BCE. This is an age of bronze and chariots, of fledgling empires and forgotten kings. But Egypt is no fledgling. It is an ancient titan, a superpower at the very apex of its imperial glory. For nearly 300 years, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom have reigned supreme. Their disciplined armies, led by the king himself in his golden chariot, have marched victorious from the cataracts of Nubia in the south, deep into the heart of Africa, to the banks of the Euphrates in Syria to the north. The Hittite Empire, their only true rival, is kept at bay through intricate diplomacy and the constant threat of war. Vassal kings from Canaan to Libya send lavish tribute: gold, ivory, ebony, horses, and human beings stow the court of the pharaoh, prostrating themselves before his magnificence. This was an empire of unparalleled wealth. The gold mines of Nubia flowed like a river into the royal treasuries, funding the construction of monuments so vast, so impossibly grand, that they seemed built by gods rather than men. The temples of Karnak and Luxor grew into sprawling cities of worship, forests of stone columns reaching for the heavens. The bureaucracy that administered this vast empire was a marvel of organization, a complex machine of scribes, governors, and priests who kept the kingdom running with meticulous efficiency. Egypt was stable, it was powerful, and it was, by every conceivable ancient metric, eternal. At the absolute center of this universe of power sat a single incandescent figure. He was more than a king, more than an emperor. He was the pharaoh. To understand Egypt is to understand the office of the pharaoh, for he was the divine fulcrum upon which the entire cosmos balanced. He was not merely a representative of the gods. In the complex theology of Egypt, he was a god. He was the living incarnation of Horus, the falcon-headed god of kingship and the sky. He was the son of Ra, the all-powerful creator and sun god, from whom he drew his ultimate authority. When he died, he would mystically merge with Osiris, the lord of the afterlife, ensuring his own eternity and the continuity of the kingdom. His titles alone speak to this reality: the mighty bull, lord of the two lands, the golden Horus. His word was not merely law, it was divine utterance. His decrees shaped reality. To defy the pharaoh was unthinkable, an act of cosmic treason. It was to rebel against the sun, the sky, and the very fabric of existence. For the pharaoh's primary function, his sacred duty, was to uphold the principle of Ma'at. Ma'at is a concept so fundamental to the Egyptian mind that it is difficult to fully translate. It is truth, justice, harmony, balance, and divine order, all woven into one. Ma'at was the force that kept the universe from collapsing back into the primordial chaos from which it was born. It ensured the sun would rise every morning, that the stars would follow their prescribed paths, and that the great river, the source of all life, would continue its eternal life-giving rhythm. The pharaoh, and the pharaoh alone, was the guarantor of Ma'at. His rituals, his pronouncements, his very existence maintained this fragile balance. He was the high priest of every temple, the intermediary between all gods and all of humanity. As long as Pharaoh sat securely on his throne, the world was in order. This was the foundational belief of Egyptian civilization. It was a belief that was about to be shattered. And the arena for this shattering would be the source of Egypt's life, the physical embodiment of Ma'at on earth, the river Nile. To call the Nile a river is an understatement of cosmic proportions. For the ancient Egyptians, the Nile was Egypt. The nation itself was called Kemet, the Black Land, named for the rich, dark, fertile silt deposited by the river's annual flood. Beyond this narrow ribbon of life lay the Deshret, the Red Land, the vast, lifeless deserts of sand and rock that stretched to the horizons. To be in the Black Land was to be in the realm of life, order, and civilization. To be in the Red Land was to be in the realm of death, chaos, and nothingness. The Nile was the border between existence and oblivion, and it was the sole reason existence was possible. The entire Egyptian calendar, the very rhythm of life, was dictated by the Nile's 3 seasons. First came Akhe, the season of inundation. From June to September, the river would swell with the monsoon rains from the Ethiopian highlands, overflowing its banks and covering the valley in a shallow flood. This was not a destructive event, it was a moment of national rebirth. It was the coming of the god Hapi. Hapi was not the god of the Nile. He was the Nile's life-giving flood. He was depicted as a benevolent, androgynous figure with the large belly and heavy breasts, symbolizing fertility and nourishment. When Hapi arrived, he brought the black silt that would make the harvest possible. He was the lord of the fishes and birds of the marshes, the bringer of sustenance. After the waters receded, the season of parade or growth began. The land, now coated in a fresh layer of incredibly fertile soil, was ready for planting. Farmers sowed their wheat and barley, knowing the land was blessed. Finally came Shimu, the season of harvest. From March to May, the bounty of the Nile was collected, a testament to the god's favor and the pharaoh's successful maintenance of Ma'at. This harvest not only fed the population but created the vast agricultural surpluses that funded the armies, the monumental building projects, and the luxurious lifestyles of the elite. The Nile was therefore the nation's artery, its highway, its pantry, and its very soul. Its waters quenched the thirst of millions. Its currents carried the massive stone blocks for the pyramids and the grand ceremonial barges of gods and kings. The papyrus reeds that grew on its banks were transformed into the scrolls that held the empire's knowledge, its literature, and its sacred texts. The mud of the Nile was believed to be the very substance of creation. The great ram-headed god Khnum, the divine potter, was said to sit at his wheel, fashioning the bodies of human children and the souls of the gods themselves from the clay of the riverbank. Deeper still, the Nile was entwined with the most profound mysteries of life, death, and resurrection. The central figure of their afterlife beliefs was the great god Osiris. In the foundational myth, Osiris was a wise and just king who was murdered by his jealous brother Set. His body was dismembered and cast into the Nile. His devoted wife, the powerful goddess Isis, painstakingly recovered his body and, through her magic, resurrected him long enough to conceive their son, Horus. Osiris then became the eternal lord of the underworld, the judge of the dead, and the promise of eternal life for all who passed his judgment. The Nile, having received his body, was considered his very bloodstream. Its annual retreat and flood was a physical manifestation of his cycle of death and resurrection. To look upon the Nile was to look upon the lifeblood of a god, a promise of eternity. To poison the Nile, therefore, was not merely an act of ecological warfare. It was an act of unimaginable sacrilege. It was a multi-layered theological assault. It was to strike at Hapi, the bringer of fertility. It was to defile the creative substance of Khnum. It was to grotesquely mock the divine bloodstream of Osiris. And most of all, it was to tell the pharaoh, the living Horus and guarantor of Maat, that the cosmic order he commanded was a fragile illusion that could be broken at a word. It was to declare that the gods of Egypt were powerless to protect their most sacred possession. And it was into this world, this golden cage of divine order, imperial might and absolute conviction, that a people languished, their existence a glaring contradiction to the principle of Maat. Deep within this empire of splendor, a nation of slaves labored in obscurity and bitterness. They were the Hebrews, the descendants of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Their own histories told that they had entered Egypt generations before, not as slaves, but as an honored family under the protection of their kinsman Joseph, who had risen to become the vizier of Egypt. But the wheel of fortune and the dynasties of kings had turned. The book of Exodus states it starkly. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Wary of this large and distinct foreign population living in their midst, fearing they might join with Egypt's enemies in a time of war, this new dynasty reversed their status. The honored guests became state property. For decades, perhaps centuries, they had toiled under the merciless Egyptian sun. Their lives were an endless cycle of servitude, their backs bent to the monumental tasks of the state. The scripture says they were forced to build the great treasure cities, or supply depots of Pithom and Ramesses. Imagine the scene. While the priests of Ra chanted hymns in magnificent temples, the Hebrew slaves were mixing mud and straw. While the pharaoh paraded in his golden chariot, they were hauling stones under the lash of Egyptian overseers. Their lives were made bitter with hard bondage in mortar, in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. A pharaoh, fearful of their growing numbers, had even decreed that all their newborn sons be cast into the Nile, a command to drown them in the very river that symbolized life. Their suffering was the discordant note in the grand symphony of Egyptian order. It was the foundational injustice upon which the golden age of the new kingdom was built. And from this crucible of affliction, a cry went up. It was not a plea to Osiris, Ra, or Isis, the powerful visible gods of their masters. It was a desperate prayer sent out into the silence, addressed to the forgotten God of their forefathers, Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, an unseen, formless God whose name had not been spoken in power for 400 years, a God for whom there were no statues, no temples, and no priesthood, the God of slaves. This was the state of the world, an empire at the height of its power, secure in its wealth, its military might, and its theology. A divine king who believed he held the strings of the cosmos, a sacred river that was the source and symbol of all life, and a population of slaves whose silent suffering was about to be answered. A storm was gathering on the divine horizon, a conflict conceived in bondage and destined to be waged upon the soul of an empire. Egypt was a golden cage, magnificent, awe-inspiring, and seemingly indestructible. But its bars were forged from injustice, and its foundation was built upon the misery of the oppressed. The stage was set. The characters were in place. All that was missing was the catalyst, the voice from the wilderness that would command the golden cage to break. If the stage for this divine drama was the apex of Egyptian power, then the actors chosen to walk upon it were, by any worldly measure, its complete antithesis. The power that had heard the cries of the enslaved did not choose to manifest itself in a manner that Egypt would understand. It did not send a rival king with a mighty army. It did not dispatch a silver-tongued ambassador from a competing empire. It did not incite a glorious armed rebellion from within. Instead, the champions of this unseen god were, perhaps, the most improbable challengers imaginable. They were two elderly brothers from the very slave caste they sought to liberate, men whose prime had long since passed them by. The elder, Aaron, was 83 years old, a man known among his people for his eloquence, and the younger, his brother Moses, was 80. A man whose life was a tapestry of contradictions. A prince raised in splendor, a murderer fleeing justice, and a shepherd humbled by the desolate wilderness. These were the men sent to confront a living God, and to demand the release of an empire's most valuable economic asset. To understand the sheer audacity of their mission, we must first understand the broken and reforged man at its center, Moses. The story of Moses is a saga of a man caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. He was born under a death sentence. The reigning pharaoh, fearful of the burgeoning Hebrew population, had issued a genocidal decree. Every newborn son was to be cast into the Nile and drowned. It was an act of brutal state control, designed to crush the spirit and the future of the Hebrew people. Yet, in a profound act of divine irony, the very river intended to be his grave became his salvation. Placed in a waterproof basket by his desperate mother, the infant Moses was discovered and adopted by none other than Pharaoh's own daughter. And so, the Hebrew child who should have been a casualty of the crown was raised as a prince of Egypt. He grew up in the unimaginable luxury and privilege of the royal court. He would have worn the finest linen, eaten from plates of gold, and been educated in all the complex wisdom of the Egyptians. He learned their intricate theology, their hieroglyphic script, their strategies of warfare, and their arts of statecraft. He was, for all intents and purposes, an Egyptian nobleman, walking the hallowed halls of power, a potential commander in the mightiest army on earth. But he carried a secret. He knew he was not one of them. The blood of the enslaved people who built the monuments he lived amongst flowed through his own veins. This duality must have forged a deep conflict within him. Every day, he would have witnessed the stark contrast between his gilded life and the bitter servitude of his kinsmen. This internal schism came to a violent head when Moses, now a grown man, saw an Egyptian taskmaster mercilessly beating a Hebrew slave. In that moment, the prince's identity fractured. The years of Egyptian conditioning gave way to a primal instinct of kinship and justice. In a fit of rage, he struck the Egyptian down, killing him and burying his body in the sand. This was more than an act of violence, it was a choice. He had chosen his side. He had rejected the Egyptian oppressor and defended the Hebrew oppressed. He had, in his own mind, perhaps begun the liberation. But the world is rarely so simple. The next day, Moses attempted to intervene in a fight between two Hebrews, seeking to establish himself as a peacemaker, a leader for his people. The response he received was a devastating rejection. "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" The secret was out. And the rejection was absolute. Not only was he now a fugitive from Egyptian justice, but his own people, the very ones he sought to champion, had cast him out. They did not see a savior. They saw a presumptuous, violent man who had brought more trouble upon them. He was accepted by neither world. The Egyptian prince was a murderer. The Hebrew kinsman was an unwanted meddler. With his life in danger and his identity in ruins, Moses did the only thing he could. He fled. He ran east, far from the lush Nile Valley, deep into the stark and unforgiving wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula, to the land of Midian. The prince of Egypt, trained to command armies and rule cities, became a fugitive shepherd. For 40 years he wandered these desolate landscapes. 40 years. An entire lifetime for many in the ancient world. Imagine the profound psychological transformation. The pride of the prince was stripped away. The ambitions of a would-be revolutionary were scoured clean by the wind and the sun. The noise and intrigue of the royal court were replaced by the profound, crushing silence of the desert and the simple rhythms of caring for a flock of sheep. He married, he had children, he grew old. The world of Egypt, with its gods and its slaves, must have seemed like a distant dream, a life that belonged to another man. The fire of his youth had been banked into cold embers. He was a man broken by the wilderness, a forgotten relic of a forgotten past. It was here, in this state of complete humility and obscurity, that Moses had his own confrontation with the divine. At the foot of Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, a place that would later be known as Sinai, he saw a phenomenon that defied all natural law, a desert bush that was engulfed in flames, yet was not consumed by the fire. The leaves were not blackened, the branches were not turned to ash. It burned with a living, eternal fire. This was no ordinary flame. This was a symbol of a power that was absolute but not destructive, a presence that was intensely pure but did not annihilate that which it touched. As Moses drew near, a voice spoke from the heart of the fire, calling him by name. It was the God of his ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this God had seen the suffering of his people in Egypt, had heard their cry, and was now commissioning this 80-year-old, forgotten shepherd to be their deliverer. The command was simple and utterly terrifying. I am sending you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Moses' response was not the bold acceptance of a hero. It was the terrified, deeply human protest of a man who knew his own inadequacy all too well. His objections, laid out in the scriptures, reveal the depths of his brokenness. First, he objected based on his own identity. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? It was a cry from the heart. I am a nobody. I am a fugitive. I am a failed leader who was rejected by everyone. I have no power, no status, no authority. The divine answer was not to build up Moses' ego, but to shift the focus entirely. I will certainly be with you. The mission's success would not depend on who Moses was, but on who was with him. Second, Moses objected based on authority. Indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, "The God of your fathers has sent me to you," and they say to me, "What is his name?" What shall I say to them? This was a crucial question in the ancient world. A name held the essence and power of a being. To know a god's name was to have a measure of connection to them. The gods of Egypt had names. Ra Osiris, Isis Ammonius. They had functions and identities. The God of the Hebrews had been silent for centuries. What was his name? The answer given from the fire is one of the most profound and mysterious statements in the history of religion. I am that I am. In Hebrew, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. He was then told to tell the people, I am has sent me to you. This was not a name in the Egyptian sense. It was not a label for a deity who controlled a specific domain like the sun or the afterlife. It was a declaration of absolute, underived eternal being. It meant he is the source of all existence. It meant he is not defined by creation. He defines it. He is the self-existent one, the ultimate reality, beside whom the elaborate pantheon of Egypt were mere constructs. It was an answer of staggering theological depth, given to a humble shepherd. Third, Moses objected based on credibility. But suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice, suppose they say, the Lord has not appeared to you. He remembered the sting of his people's rejection 40 years earlier. Why would they believe him now? In response, God gave him 3 signs. His shepherd's staff would turn into a serpent and back again. His hand would become leprous and then be restored. And as a final ominous foreshadowing, he would be able to take water from the Nile and turn it to blood on the dry ground. These were not mere magic tricks. They were credentials, tangible proofs of a supernatural commission. Even with this, Moses resisted. His fourth objection was deeply personal, rooted in his own insecurity. "O my Lord, I am not eloquent. I am slow of speech and of a slow tongue." Perhaps he had a stutter. Or perhaps the 40 years of solitude had simply made him unaccustomed to public speaking. He felt he did not have the charisma or rhetorical skill to persuade a nation or confront a king. The divine response was both a rebuke and a reassurance. Who has made man's mouth? Or who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall say. Finally, having exhausted all his other arguments, Moses offered his last desperate plea. "Oh my Lord, please send someone else." It was the raw, honest cry of a man overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of the task. He simply did not want to do it. And it was only then, in response to this final refusal, that the divine plan revealed its second component. God's anger was kindled, but he provided a concession. He told Moses of his elder brother, Aaron the Levite. "Is not Aaron the Levite your brother? I know that he can speak well." Aaron would be Moses's mouthpiece, his prophet. Moses would receive the divine word, and Aaron would speak it to the people and to Pharaoh. They would be a team, a dyad of prophecy and proclamation. Moses, the hesitant, contemplative visionary. Aaron, the articulate, public-facing priest. And so the mission was set. Moses, the man who had been stripped of everything, his princely status, his youthful ambitions, his self-confidence, was now clothed in a new authority. His simple shepherd's staff, a tool for guiding sheep, was now designated the rod of God, a conduit for divine power. Reunited with his brother Aaron, the two old men set out on the long journey back to the land of the Nile. This was no triumphant return. They led no army. They carried no wealth. They were armed only with the divine command and a shepherd's staff. Moses was returning to the scene of his greatest crime and his greatest failure, the place of his power and his shame. He was returning to face a new Pharaoh, a man who wielded the same absolute authority as the one from whom he had fled. They were, in every sense, the unlikeliest of messengers, stepping out of the silence of the desert and into the heart of the world's greatest empire to deliver a message that would bring it to its knees. The challenge was about to be issued. Armed with the divine mandate and accompanied by his brother, Moses re-entered the land of Egypt. The journey from the desolate wilderness of Midian to the bustling heart of the Nile Valley was a journey back in time, a return to the scene of his failure and his shame. Yet, he was not the same man who had fled 40 years prior. The pride of the prince had been replaced by the humility of the shepherd, and the emptiness of his own power had been filled with the terrifying presence of the God, who called himself, I Am. Their first task was not to confront Pharaoh, but to rally the very people they sought to save. Gathering the elders of the Israelites, Aaron spoke the words that Moses had received in the desert. He recounted the promise made to their forefathers and declared that their long period of suffering had been seen, their cries had been heard. And to validate these incredible claims, Moses performed the signs God had given him. He cast his staff to the ground, and it became a serpent. He placed his hand in his cloak, and it emerged white as snow with leprosy, only to be restored moments later. For a people crushed by generations of hopeless servitude, this was a spark in the deepest darkness. The scripture says the people believed, and when they heard that their God had looked upon their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshipped. For the first time in centuries, a fragile hope took root in the slave quarters of Egypt. But this nascent faith was about to face its first brutal test. The true confrontation was yet to come. Imagine the scene as these two elderly men, Moses and Aaron, navigate the sprawling, magnificent precincts of Pharaoh's capital. They walk past colossal statues of the very king they intend to challenge, past temples dedicated to the gods whose authority they are about to defy. They are ushered finally into the throne room, the epicenter of earthly power and the symbolic heart of the cosmos. This is no mere audience chamber. It is a theological statement carved in stone and gold. Towering columns painted with vibrant scenes of Pharaoh's victories and divine parentage, rise to a ceiling painted like the night sky. The air is thick with the scent of expensive incense, a fragrant offering to the gods and a declaration of wealth. Sunlight, cleverly directed through high windows, illuminates the dust motes dancing in the air, creating an ethereal, otherworldly atmosphere. At the far end of this cavernous hall, upon a raised dais of polished alabaster, sits the pharaoh. He is adorned in the regalia of his office, the striped Nemes headdress, the false beard symbolizing his eternal nature, and clutching the crook and flail, symbols of his role as both shepherd and judge of his people. He is flanked by his highest officials, the vizier, the chief treasurer, the high priests in their leopard skin robes, and the top generals of his army. Here Pharaoh is not a man. He is a living icon, the point of contact between heaven and earth. The silence in the room is not empty. It is heavy with reverence and absolute power. Into this sanctum of perfect, intimidating order, walk Moses and Aaron, two Semitic elders, likely dressed in simple woolen garments, their faces weathered by the desert sun. They are an anomaly, a disruption to the carefully orchestrated grandeur of the court. They prostrate themselves as required, but when they rise, they do not bring tribute or offer platitudes. Through Aaron they deliver a message of breathtaking audacity. It is not a request. It is a command. Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, "Let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." Let us pause to dissect the sheer insolence of this statement from the Egyptian perspective. First, the speaker is identified as Yahweh, the God of Israel. To Pharaoh, this name is meaningless. It does not appear in any of his extensive lists of gods and goddesses. There is no temple to this Yahweh in all of Egypt. He is the God of a slave people, and in the rigid hierarchy of the ancient world, the power of a god was often seen as proportional to the power of the nation that worshipped him. To Pharaoh, this was like a provincial governor invoking the authority of an unknown village chieftain. Second, the command itself, "Let my people go." These people were not guests. They were state property. They were the engine of Pharaoh's immense building programs, a source of free labor that was fundamental to the Egyptian economy. The demand was economically ruinous and politically unthinkable. Third, the reason given, "that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." This would have sounded suspicious if not utterly absurd. A 3-day journey into the desert? To worship a god he had never heard of? To the pragmatic and cynical mind of a ruler like Pharaoh, this was almost certainly a pretext, a thinly veiled attempt at a mass escape. Pharaoh's response, as recorded in the book of Exodus, is the very crux of the entire conflict to come. It is a perfect encapsulation of imperial arrogance and theological dismissal. He leans forward on his throne, perhaps with a look of bemused contempt, and delivers his verdict. "Who is Yahweh, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know Yahweh, nor will I let Israel go." This is not a simple no. This is a fundamental challenge. Who is Yahweh? Is a rhetorical question dripping with scorn. It means, by what authority does this entity command me? What are his credentials? Where are his armies, his temples, his history of power? I do not know Yahweh is a theological declaration of nullification. In Pharaoh's worldview, a god who is unknown to him, the divine ruler of the greatest empire on earth, is effectively a non-entity. He is declaring Yahweh to be irrelevant. And the final phrase, "nor will I let Israel go," is the iron fist of absolute monarchy. The debate is over. The request is denied. The audience is finished. But Pharaoh does not leave it at that. To be challenged, even by an insignificant source, requires a demonstration of his own superior power. He must not only refuse the demand, he must punish the people on whose behalf it was made. He must show these slaves that their newfound hope, their appeal to this Yahweh, would not lead to freedom but to greater suffering. It was a cruel but calculated act of political and psychological warfare. He summoned the Hebrew foremen who served under his Egyptian taskmasters. The decree was issued. The daily quota of bricks would remain the same. However, the straw, the crucial binding agent needed to make the bricks strong and durable, would no longer be supplied by the state. The slaves were now responsible for gathering their own straw from the fields of stubble left after the harvest. The practical effect of this decree was devastating. It turned an already crushing workload into an impossible one. The people were scattered throughout the land, desperately trying to gather enough stubble to meet their quotas. They were exhausted, frantic. And when they inevitably failed to produce the same number of bricks, the Egyptian taskmasters beat the Hebrew foremen, mocking them. "Why have you not fulfilled your task in making brick both yesterday and today as before?" Pharaoh's strategy worked perfectly. The fragile hope of the Israelites shattered. Their suffering had intensified, and they laid the blame squarely at the feet of the men who had promised them deliverance. The Hebrew foremen confronted Moses and Aaron, their words dripping with anguish and accusation. "Let the Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us abhorrent in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to kill us." This was a moment of utter desolation for Moses. He had obeyed the divine command, and the result was catastrophic. He was now a pariah, not only to the Egyptians but to his own people. He had brought them not relief but a heavier yoke. He had given Pharaoh a pretext to crush them further. In this moment of crisis, his faith was shaken to its core. He turned back to the God who had sent him, and his prayer was not one of pious trust, but of raw human complaint. "Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Why is it you have sent me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all." It is a moment of profound doubt. Moses stands on the precipice, his mission in ruins. But the divine response is not one of anger at his doubt, but of powerful reassurance. God essentially tells Moses this is not a failure. It is the necessary prelude. Pharaoh's arrogance must be exposed before it can be broken. "Now, you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. With a strong hand he will let them go, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of his land." God reiterates his covenant name, Yahweh, the name that signifies his enduring promise, and recommissions the two brothers. The first approach had failed to persuade, but it had succeeded in its true purpose. It had caused Pharaoh to reveal the depths of his arrogant heart. And so they went again. Back to the throne room. Back into the presence of the defiant king. This time they came prepared for a demonstration of power. This was the moment for the credentials to be presented. As instructed by God, Aaron cast down his shepherd's staff before Pharaoh and his court. And as it struck the polished floor, it writhed and transformed, its wooden form rearranging itself into the sleek, muscular body of a serpent. We must understand the potent symbolism at play here. This was not a random choice of animal. The serpent, specifically the cobra, known as the uraeus, was one of the most powerful symbols in all of Egypt. It adorned the very crown of Pharaoh. It represented the goddess Wadjet, the divine protector of the king and of Lower Egypt. The uraeus was said to spit fire at the Pharaoh's enemies. It was a symbol of legitimacy, of divine authority, and of lethal protective power. For Aaron's staff to become a serpent in the Pharaoh's own court was a direct, symbolic challenge. It was taking the king's own symbol of authority and manifesting it independently, a sign that the power it represented was not exclusive to Pharaoh. Pharaoh, however, remained unimpressed. He had seen strange things. He lived in a world where magic, or Heka, was considered a real and potent force. Heka was the divine energy that the gods used to create the world, and it could be channeled by skilled priests and magicians. To Pharaoh, this was not necessarily a unique divine act, but rather a powerful display of foreign magic. He decided to meet magic with magic. He summoned his own experts, the wise men, the sorcerers, and the Chartamim, the sacred scribes who were the masters of Egypt's esoteric arts. These men, later given the traditional names Jans and Jambres, were the high priests of the cult of Thoth, the god of wisdom and magic. They were the kingdom's chief illusionists and masters of ritual power. They came before the throne, confident in their ancient arts. They too cast down their staffs, and through their secret arts, whether through sleight of hand, hypnotism, or perhaps a knowledge of certain reptiles that stiffen into a catatonic state, they replicated the feat suddenly. The floor of the throne room was slithering with serpents. For Pharaoh, this was a moment of vindication. He had called the bluff. This Yahweh was merely another source of magical power, and the priests of Egypt were able to match it. It confirmed his initial assessment. The confrontation was not a clash between a true god and a false one, but a contest between rival magicians. His worldview was for the moment secure. He had no reason to yield. But then, something happened that shattered this comfortable equilibrium. The sign was not yet complete. Aaron's serpent staff, the one that had sprung from a humble shepherd's rod, did not just lie among the others. It began to move with a predatory will. It swiveled its head, fixed its gaze upon the serpents of the Egyptian magicians, and then one by one it attacked and swallowed them whole. The symbolic meaning was terrifying and unmistakable. The power represented by Moses and Aaron was not merely equal to the power of Egypt. It did not just match it, it consumed it, devoured it. The authority of the Hebrew God did not just challenge the authority of the Egyptian court and its gods, it annihilated it. The sign had escalated from a challenge to a depiction of total conquest. The magic of the pharaoh's wise men had been rendered impotent, literally swallowed by the power they had sought to imitate. The room would have fallen into a stunned silence. The magicians stood empty-handed, their power exposed as inferior. The viziers and generals would have looked on with a new sense of unease. A clear and terrible omen had been given in the very heart of their power. Yet we are told, Pharaoh's heart grew hard and he did not heed them. He had seen the sign. He had witnessed his own royal symbol of power be bested and consumed. But to acknowledge the meaning of that sign would be to dismantle his entire identity. It would be to admit that there was a power in the universe greater than himself and greater than the gods of his kingdom. It would mean that the demand of this slave god had to be taken seriously. The cost to his pride, to his divine self-conception, was too great. He chose willful blindness. He rationalized what he had seen. Perhaps it was a trick of a higher order, but still a trick. He clung to his initial defiance, hardening his heart against the evidence that was now plain before him. He had been given a symbolic warning, a prelude written with serpents on his own throne room floor, showing him precisely how this conflict would end, with his power being consumed. He refused to read the message. That refusal sealed his fate, and the fate of his nation. The time for symbolic gestures was over. The God of Israel had offered a sign, and it had been rejected. The first confrontation had ended not in capitulation, but in hardened resolve on both sides. The war of wills had been established. And now the war of gods was about to begin in earnest, not with a trick in a palace, but with a cataclysm that would strike at the very lifeblood of Egypt itself. The first warning had been ignored. The first plague was now inevitable. The throne room had fallen silent. The consumed serpents were a stark and chilling omen, a symbolic miniature of a promised conquest. But symbols, however potent, can be dismissed by a sufficiently stubborn will. The unease in Pharaoh's court was a fleeting shadow, banished by the sheer, immovable reality of the king's authority. Pharaoh had seen the sign, weighed it against his own divine self-conception, and found it wanting. He turned his back on the warning, retreating into the gilded fortress of his own pride. He had made his choice. And so the conflict was set to escalate beyond the realm of symbols and enter the world of substance. The next demonstration would not be a contained spectacle within the palace walls. It would be a public and catastrophic assault on the entire nation, targeting the very source of its existence. The God of the Hebrews chose his arena with terrifying precision. He would not strike at a granary, a garrison, or even a temple. He would strike at the heart of all Egyptian life and theology, the great river Nile. The divine command came to Moses, not in the dead of night, but in the clear light of day. Go to Pharaoh in the morning, behold, he is going out to the water. And you shall stand by the river's bank to meet him. And the rod which was turned to a serpent you shall take in your hand. And you shall say to him, Yahweh the God of the Hebrews has sent me to you, saying, Let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But indeed until now you would not hear. Thus says Yahweh. By this you shall know that I am Yahweh. Behold, I will strike the waters which are in the river with the rod that is in my hand, and they shall be turned to blood. Pharaoh's morning excursion to the Nile was not a casual stroll. It was a sacred, daily ritual, a cornerstone of his function as the guarantor of Ma'at. As the sun, the eye of his father Ra, began its ascent, the living Horus on earth would present himself to the nation's lifeblood. It was an act of communion and control. He would make offerings, recite hymns, and ritually ensure the river's continued benevolence. It was a moment of serene public reaffirmation of the unbreakable bond between the king, the gods, and the prosperity of the land. Crowds might gather at a respectful distance to witness this display of cosmic harmony, to see their god-king communing with the river god and feel secure that all was right with the world. It was into this carefully orchestrated scene of imperial piety that Moses and Aaron once again intruded. Imagine the contrast. Pharaoh, adorned in pure white linen, surrounded by his retinue of priests and bodyguards, standing on a ceremonial landing. And there waiting for him are the two familiar, troublesome elders. Their presence alone was a discordant note, a disruption of the sacred space. The final warning was issued. The demand was repeated, not as a plea, but as an ultimatum. The words of Yahweh were spoken clearly one last time, offering Pharaoh a final chance to acknowledge a power beyond his own and avert disaster. This was the precipice. This was the last moment of the old world. Pharaoh, standing at the edge of the very source of his empire's life, likely met this final demand with cold disdain. He had already given his answer in the throne room. His heart, already firm in its defiance, would not be swayed by another verbal threat from the messengers of a slave god. He refused, perhaps with a wave of his hand, a scornful word, or simply a stony silence. He rejected the ultimatum. And then the moment came. As commanded, Aaron, the spokesman, the prophet, lifted the simple shepherd's staff high. This was the same piece of wood that had bested the magician's rods. The humble instrument now designated the rod of God. He held it aloft in the morning sun, a conduit of cosmic defiance. Then, before the eyes of the Pharaoh, his court, and any onlookers on the bank, Aaron brought the staff down and struck the surface of the great river. What happened next was not a slow discoloration, not a gradual mixing of red sediment. The biblical narrative describes a transformation that was immediate, absolute, and horrifying. The instant the wood touched the water, a supernatural corruption spread with unnatural speed. Imagine a single drop of ink falling on a vast sheet of papyrus, but instead of just staining, it causes the very substance of the papyrus to transform. A ghastly crimson bloom exploded from the point of impact, not floating on the surface, but seizing the very nature of the water itself. The life-giving green-blue waters of the Nile, the sacred bloodstream of Osiris, curdled and changed. In mere moments, the entire visible expanse of the river turned into a thick, murky, and horrifying flow of what could only be described as blood. This was not the reddish-brown color of the silt that came with the blessed inundation. This was the deep, obscene red of the slaughterhouse, the color of a mortal wound dealt to the world itself. The artery of the nation had been violently severed. The first wave of the assault was on the eyes. The familiar, beautiful vista of the Nile, the sight that defined home for every Egyptian, was gone, replaced by a grotesque parody. But the second wave, following immediately after, was an assault on the nose. An appalling stench began to rise from the river's surface. Not the rich, earthy smell of the fertile flood, but the coppery metallic reek of shed blood mingled with the sickly sweet odor of decay. It was the smell of a vast, open grave, and it began to drift on the morning breeze, spreading from the riverbanks and into the city, a suffocating miasma of death. Then came the ecological cataclysm. The scripture is stark and brutal. The fish that were in the river died, and the river stank. The Nile teemed with life. It was the primary source of protein for the common people. Great Nile perch, tilapia, catfish, eels, all of it, the entire aquatic population was annihilated in an instant. Deprived of oxygen and poisoned by the supernatural change, they went belly up by the millions. A shimmering silver blanket of death covered the bloody surface, their bloated bodies bobbing grotesquely in the sluggish crimson current. The fishing industry, a pillar of the Egyptian economy and the livelihood for thousands, ceased to exist in a single moment. The nets of the fishermen brought up only rotting carcasses. The horror, however, was not confined to the main channel of the great river. This was no localized phenomenon. The plague was pervasive, absolute, and inescapable. The divine curse followed every drop of Nile water to its destination. The scripture is terrifyingly specific. The plague was in the streams, the canals dug for irrigation, the ponds where cattle drank, and every pool of standing water. The entire water table of the nation, fed by the Nile, was corrupted. But it went even further, crossing the threshold from the public to the private, from the national to the intensely personal. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. This is perhaps the most terrifying detail of all. It means that the water already drawn, the water sitting in clay jars in the poorest peasant's hut, the water in the ornate stone basins of the nobleman's villa, the water in the sacred purification vessels within the temple sanctuaries, all of it, at the same moment, supernaturally transformed. Imagine the domestic terror. A woman reaches for a cup to give her child a drink, and finds not clear water but thick, foul-smelling blood. A priest, preparing for his morning rituals, uncovers the sacred lustral basin and recoils in horror. A brewer, ready to begin his daily work, finds his vats of water, the essential ingredient for the nation's staple drink of beer, have become unusable pools of corruption. There was no escape. Every source of life had become a source of death. The people of the most powerful and sophisticated nation on earth were suddenly, terrifyingly thirsty. The fundamental necessity of life was denied to them. They could not drink. They could not cook. They could not bathe. The entire concept of ritual purity, so central to Egyptian religious life, was rendered impossible. The whole nation, from the pharaoh in his palace to the lowest servant, was made ritually unclean, trapped in a landscape of divine wrath. Panic must have set in almost immediately, followed by a desperate, frantic scramble for survival. The text tells us the response. And all the Egyptians dug all around the river for water to drink, because they could not drink the water of the river. Picture the scene. The entire population, a nation of pyramid builders, now reduced to digging frantically in the mud with their bare hands, with pots, with tools, anything. They clawed at the earth near the riverbanks, hoping to bypass the curse, hoping to tap into some deep well of groundwater that the plague had not reached. It was a picture of total humiliation. The citizens of a proud empire, turned into scavengers in their own land, desperately trying to find a single clean drop of water, while their great deified river flowed past them like a torrent of death. And this was not a fleeting event. It was not a horror that lasted for an hour or even a day. The scripture states that this nightmare persisted for 7 days. 1 week. Imagine the mounting psychological toll. Day 1 was shock and disbelief. By day 3, the unbearable stench would have permeated every home, every temple, every corner of the land. Thirst would have become agonizing. The weakest, the elderly, and the very young would have begun to suffer terribly. By day 5, desperation would have given way to despair. Any prayers offered to Hapi, to Osiris, to Pharaoh himself, were met with a silent, bloody river. The gods of Egypt were silent, impotent. By day 7, the land of Egypt was a nation traumatized, humbled, and polluted. For a full week, the very symbol of their life, their order, and their faith had been a constant, undeniable testament to their god-king's powerlessness. Pharaoh, the supposed master of Maat, had stood on the riverbank and watched as the cosmic order he was sworn to protect was single-handedly torn to shreds. He had watched the life of his nation drain away into a crimson tide of death. The first great plague was not just a blow against the people. It was a devastatingly successful attack against the gods of Egypt and the divine authority of their king. It was a message written in blood across the entire length of the country, a message that posed a terrible question: who truly commands the waters of life and death? The first warning had been given, and it was a masterpiece of horror. For 7 days, a crimson tide held the nation of Egypt hostage. For 7 days, the air was thick with the stench of decay and the palpable aura of divine judgment. To the modern mind, conditioned to seek scientific explanations, we might rush to theories of algal blooms or seismic disruption. But to the ancient Egyptian, such explanations would have been meaningless. For them, the physical world was a direct manifestation of the spiritual. Every event, from the budding of a lotus flower to a clap of thunder, was an act of the gods. And a catastrophe of this magnitude, this specificity, this totality, this was not a natural disaster. This was communication. To view the first plague as simply a miraculous, if gruesome spectacle, is to miss its terrifying genius. It was not a blunt instrument of divine rage, a random show of force. It was a masterpiece of symbolic warfare, a theological argument delivered with the force of a tidal wave. Each aspect of the plague was a carefully chosen arrow, aimed with unerring precision at a specific target within the Egyptian worldview. This was not chaos. This was a systematic, intellectual, and spiritual deconstruction of the entire pantheon of Egypt, designed to prove its impotence and expose the hollowness of its authority. To understand the bloody Nile, we must see it not as a river of water turned to blood, but as a river of ink, writing a devastating message across the face of the land. First and foremost, the plague was a direct and brutal assault on the specific deities who governed the Nile itself. The most obvious target was the benevolent god Hapi. Hapi was not merely the god of the Nile. He was the personification of its annual life-giving flood. In countless reliefs and hymns, he is depicted as a portly, androgynous figure, his large belly and full breasts symbolizing fertility, abundance, and nourishment. His titles were Lord of the Fishes and Birds of the Marshes, the Green One, the bringer of the rich black silt that was the foundation of all life. The Egyptians sang to him, "Hail to thee, O Nile, that issues from the earth and comes to keep Egypt alive." Now, imagine the people crying out to Hapi as they looked upon his domain. His river, the source of life, had become a stinking, viscous flow of death. His fish, over which he was lord, now floated as a rotting testament to his failure. The bringer of sustenance had brought forth only corruption. The waters that were meant to quicken the earth with life now poisoned it. The message, delivered with shocking clarity, was inescapable. The God who you believe embodies the flood does not control his own body. Your God of the river does not command the river. I do. It was a complete and utter humiliation of one of Egypt's most beloved and essential deities. The assault continued, striking at Khnum, the great creator god of Elephantine. Khnum, depicted with the head of a ram, was the divine potter. It was he who was believed to sit at his cosmic potter's wheel, taking the rich clay from the banks of the Nile and skillfully fashioning the bodies of all living things, including the ka, or life force, of every human child. The very substance of creation, the raw material of life itself, was the sacred mud of the Nile. Now that sacred clay was gone, replaced by a foul bloody sludge. The substance from which Khnum sculpted life was now a polluted mire of death. How could the divine potter create new life when his materials were defiled? The plague effectively severed him from his own creative function. It was a message that cut to the core of creation itself, declaring, "The very building blocks of life that your God uses are under my authority. I can corrupt the source. Your creator God is powerless to protect the substance of his own craft." Nor did the attack spare Sobuk, the powerful and feared crocodile god. As the lord of the Nile's waters, Sobuk represented the raw, untamable power of the river, its ferocity, its dangers, and its potent fertility. He was a protector of the pharaoh and a defender of the nation. Yet now the waters he ruled were a toxic wasteland. The mighty crocodiles, his sacred animals, would have been seen either fleeing the river in distress or dying within it. The domain of the fearsome crocodile god had become a placid, putrid sewer, proving him incapable of defending his own home, let alone the king or the nation. But the assault went deeper still, past the river gods and straight to the highest echelons of the state pantheon, targeting the most profound mysteries of Egyptian faith. The plague was a direct repudiation of the great god Osiris. To understand the gravity of this, one must understand the central importance of Osiris. He was the king of the afterlife, the judge of the dead, and the ultimate symbol of resurrection and eternal life. The foundational myth of Osiris was known to every Egyptian. He was a wise and just earthly king, treacherously murdered by his jealous brother, Set, the god of chaos. Set dismembered his body into 14 pieces and scattered them across the land, casting the most significant part into the Nile. Osiris's devoted wife, the goddess Isis, traveled tirelessly to recover the pieces. Upon finding them, she reassembled his body and, using her potent magic, resurrected him long enough to conceive their son and heir Horus. After this, Osiris descended to the underworld to become its eternal ruler. This myth was the bedrock of Egyptian hope for an afterlife, and the Nile was central to it. Having received and held the body of the god, the Nile was considered his very bloodstream. Its annual flood and subsequent retreat were seen as a physical yearly reenactment of his cycle of death and resurrection. The river was a living symbol of eternal hope. The first plague took this sacred narrative and twisted it into a grotesque and blasphemous parody. The God of the Hebrews effectively said, "You believe this river is the bloodstream of your resurrected God? Then behold, I will make it a river of actual blood. But this is not the blood of life and resurrection. This is the blood of death and decay, from which there is no recovery." It transformed a symbol of hope into a monument of despair. It took Egypt's most cherished story of life overcoming death and demonstrated a power that could inflict a death that life could not overcome. It was a theological masterstroke, a declaration that the story of Osiris was just Theta's story, while this power over life and death was a terrifying reality. Even the supreme deity, the sun god Ra, the father of the gods and of Pharaoh himself, was not left unchallenged. The daily cycle of the sun was the most immutable and important event in the Egyptian cosmos. Each evening, Ra was thought to enter the underworld, the Duat, sailing his solar barge through its perilous waters, fighting off the serpent of chaos, Apep, to be reborn victorious at dawn. The earthly Nile was seen as the physical reflection, the counterpart, of this celestial river in the underworld. By turning the earthly river into a corrupted flow of blood, the plague cast a symbolic shadow over Ra's own nightly journey. It polluted his path of rebirth. It was a subtle but profound message suggesting that the very path of the sun, the daily guarantee of cosmic order, was not beyond the reach of this new terrifying power. Beyond the gods themselves, the plague struck at the very heart of temporal and spiritual power. The pharaoh. The pharaoh's most essential and sacred duty was the maintenance of Ma'at's fundamental cosmic principle of truth, order, harmony, and justice. Ma'at was the force that held the universe together, and its opposite was Isfecho's injustice and lies. The pharaoh, as the sole high priest of every cult, was the only human being capable of ensuring the victory of Ma'at over Isfet. The Bloody Nile was the arrival of Isfet in its most undeniable form. It was chaos made manifest, the most predictable, orderly, and life-giving element of the Egyptian world had been plunged into a state of deathly disorder. And Pharaoh, the supposed master of Ma'at, had stood by the riverbank, utterly powerless to stop it. It was a public, week-long demonstration of his impotence. It proved, before the eyes of his entire nation, that he could not maintain the cosmic balance. It screamed to the heavens that there was a power in the universe that could shatter Ma'at at will, and the pharaoh was helpless to prevent it. This single event undermined the very foundation of his claim to divinity. If he was the son of Ra, why could he not protect this sacred river? If he was the living Horus, why were the gods not listening to his appeals? He was exposed not as a god on earth, but as a man watching his world die. Finally, the first plague was a devastating logistical attack on the entire religious infrastructure of the Egyptian state. Central to all Egyptian religious practice was the concept of ritual purity. A priest could not enter a temple, make an offering, or even stand before the statue of a god unless he was in a state of wabit, or ritual cleanliness. This required meticulous washing with pure, clean water. Indeed, the sacred statues of the gods themselves were ritually bathed each day in a ceremony that awakened them to receive their offerings. With a river of blood in every reservoir and basin of water corrupted, ritual purity became impossible. The entire priesthood of the most religious nation on earth was rendered unclean. This meant that across the length and breadth of the land, from the grandest temples at Karnak to the smallest local shrines, all worship had to cease. No offerings could be made. No hymns could be sung. No purification rituals could be performed. The gods of Egypt, in their stone houses, were effectively cut off from their people and their priests, quarantined by a tide of divinely mandated filth. They were rendered deaf, mute, and helpless, starved of the rituals that sustained them. The very system designed to honor them was paralyzed by the first blow from an enemy they could not see. This, then, was the true nature of the first plague. It was a declaration of war fought not with chariots and arrows, but with a terrifying supernatural precision. It was a complete and systematic dismantling of the Egyptian cosmos. It attacked their economy, their food supply, their social order, and most devastatingly, their faith. It posed a single brutal question to every man, woman, and child suffering from thirst in the land of the pharaohs. Who holds the power over life and death? The pantheon of gods whose sacred domains have been turned to ruin, or the unseen god of slaves who commanded it with a word and a staff? The warning had been delivered, and its message was as clear as the water had once been. The gods of Egypt cannot save you. The land of Egypt was suffocating. For 7 days, the nation had been held in the grip of a waking nightmare. Its divine river, the cradle of its civilization, had become its open grave. The stench of death was its atmosphere. The spectacle of decay its horizon. The economy was shattered. The people were suffering, and the gods were silent. Every aspect of this catastrophe was a direct, public, and undeniable refutation of the pharaoh's power and his kingdom's faith. The national crisis had reached its apex. All eyes, brimming with desperation and fear, turned to the one man who was supposed to be the master of the cosmos, the pharaoh. What would he do? How would the living God respond to this apocalyptic assault on his divinity? His response is perhaps the most chilling and revealing moment in the entire saga. Faced with the supernatural cataclysm, an undeniable act of a power far beyond his own, Pharaoh did not fall to his knees in repentance. He did not lead his priests in a national plea for mercy. He did not acknowledge the truth that flowed in a crimson tide past his palace windows. He called for his magicians. This act alone is a profound insight into his mind. He was refusing to engage with the event on its own terms as a divine judgment. Instead, he sought to reframe it, to drag it down from the realm of the divine into a category he could manage, the world of Heka, of magic. He summoned his Chartamim, the sacred scribes, the wise men who guarded the secret knowledge of the gods, the same men whose serpent staffs had been consumed just days before. Their task was not to cleanse the Nilian impossible feat they surely knew they could not accomplish. Their task was far more subtle, and in a way far more insidious. It was to replicate the miracle. Imagine the scene. A space is cleared in the palace or a temple courtyard, away from the horrifying vista of the dead river. Servants bring forth a vessel, a bowl of clay or a basin of stone filled with the precious, clear water that had been painstakingly dug from the earth. This small container of purity stood in stark contrast to the millions of gallons of corruption flowing just beyond the walls. Before the pharaoh and his anxious court, the magicians began their work, chanting their ancient incantations, invoking the names of Thoth, the god of wisdom, and Isis, the goddess of magic. They performed their secret arts. Perhaps they used chemical compounds known only to the temple elite, minerals like red ochre or hematite that could instantly and dramatically color the water. Or perhaps their enchantments involved a genuine, if limited, channeling of esoteric forces. The method is irrelevant. The result is what mattered. Before the assembled court, the small amount of clean water in the basin transformed. It turned red. To a logical mind, this is an act of supreme absurdity. The house is on fire, and the response is to proudly demonstrate that you too can light a match. Yet, in the twisted logic of self-preservation and imperial pride, this act was a monumental victory for Pharaoh. It was an intellectual anesthetic. By successfully replicating the plague on a miniature scale, the magicians provided Pharaoh with the exact justification he needed to maintain his defiance. This small, successful imitation allowed him to perform a crucial mental categorization. The plague was not a unique, divine act from a transcendent god, a netjer. It was merely a very powerful, very large-scale act of Heka or magic. This meant that Moses and Aaron were not prophets of the Almighty. They were simply rival sorcerers of formidable skill. The contest was not, therefore, a war between the true God and the false pantheon of Egypt. It was a contest of court magicians. And if it was a contest of skill, then Pharaoh had not been theologically defeated. He had simply been temporarily outmatched in a magical arts competition. His own experts had now proven they understood the principle of the trick, even if they could not yet match its scale. This intellectual loophole was all he needed. It allowed him to save face before his viziers and generals. He was not a powerless king whose gods had abandoned him. He was a ruler facing down foreign agents with impressive, but ultimately comprehensible, abilities. He could project an aura of understanding and control, even as his people suffered. It was a defense mechanism against a reality too terrifying to accept. To admit that the bloody Nile was a divine judgment from Yahweh would be to admit that his entire life, his title, his divinity, and the entire structure of Egyptian civilization was a lie. It was a cost his pride could not and would not pay. And it is here, in the aftermath of this hollow magical victory, that the scripture delivers its famous and profoundly debated verdict. And Pharaoh's heart grew hard, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had said. This phrase, the hardening of the heart, becomes the central refrain of the plague's narrative, the pivot upon which the entire tragedy turns. What does it mean? Was this an act of Pharaoh's own stubborn volition, or was it a supernatural act performed upon him by God? The scriptures, fascinatingly, support both interpretations, weaving them together into a complex portrait of human defiance and divine sovereignty. In some passages, the text says simply, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, or he hardened his heart. This points to Pharaoh's own agency, his personal responsibility. The Egyptian concept of the heart, the IB, was the seat of intelligence, emotion, and conscience. It was the center of one's moral being. To harden one's own heart was to consciously shut down one's capacity for empathy, to refuse to see reason, to actively choose a path of defiance in the face of overwhelming evidence. Pharaoh saw the suffering of his people. He smelled the stench of death from his own sacred river. He had witnessed a power that consumed the magic of his wisest men, but he actively chose to suppress his conscience, to ignore the evidence of his own senses, and to barricade himself within the fortress of his pride. In this view, he is the author of his own damnation. However, in other passages, the text states explicitly, "The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart." This is a more challenging theological concept. Does this mean Pharaoh had no free will? Was he a mere puppet, forced into a state of defiance against his will? Most theological interpretations do not see it this way. Rather, they see it as a judicial hardening. It is not that God infuses a soft heart with evil, but that he gives a man over to the evil he has already chosen. It is a divine judgment in itself. When a person like Pharaoh so resolutely and repeatedly rejects the light, resists the truth, and hardens his own heart, a point is reached where God confirms that choice. He removes the restraints of common grace and allows that heart to become as impenetrable as the person wishes it to be. It is the spiritual equivalent of a muscle, exercised in defiance, becoming permanently locked in that state. God solidifies the condition that Pharaoh himself has created. A further interpretation sees this divine hardening as instrumental, for the full measure of Yahweh's power to be displayed not just to Pharaoh, but to the Egyptians and most importantly, to the Israelites who needed to know the God who was saving them. A compliant opponent would not suffice. If Pharaoh had relented after the first plague, the lesson would have been incomplete. God's authority over water would have been demonstrated. But what about his authority over land, air, life, disease, light, darkness, and death itself? By strengthening Pharaoh's resolve, by hardening his already defiant heart, God ensured that the king would stand his ground, thus creating the necessary stage for the full sequence of judgments to unfold. It was a divine strategy to ensure that the revelation of his power would be absolute and unforgettable. These two ideas, Pharaoh's culpability and God's sovereignty, are not necessarily contradictory. They may be two sides of the same terrible coin. A perfect, terrifying synergy between a man's prideful intransigence and a God's sovereign purpose. And so, armed with the flimsy excuse provided by his magicians, and his heart now sealed against any appeal to reason or compassion, Pharaoh performed his final act of defiance. The scripture says, "So Pharaoh turned and went into his house, nor did he set his heart to this." Consider the profound symbolism of this simple action. He physically turned his back on the problem. He turned away from the evidence of the bloody river, away from the suffering of his people digging desperately in the mud for a drop of water. He went into his house. He retreated from the public crisis into the private, insulated comfort of his palace, a bubble of order amidst a world of chaos. He shut the door on the reality of his failure. And the final phrase is the most damning. Nor did he set his heart to this. The literal Hebrew can be read as, he did not put it on his heart. He refused to internalize it, to let it affect him, to grapple with its meaning. He compartmentalized the national catastrophe, filing it away as an annoyance to be dealt with, rather than a divine verdict to be heeded. He had been shown a sign in the throne room, the serpent that consumed his own. He had ignored it. He was then given a cataclysmic blow that struck at the heart of his nation's identity, economy, and faith. His response was to watch his magicians do a parlor trick, and then go inside for dinner. The first great warning, a message written in blood across the length of his kingdom, had been delivered. It had been understood. And it had been willfully and utterly rejected. Pharaoh had made his stand. He had chosen his pride over his people, his title over the truth. The gauntlet had been thrown down, and he had stubbornly refused to yield. The divine antagonist had shown what he could do to the water, the passive environment of Egypt. The stage was now set for the second act. The warning had failed, and therefore the judgment must escalate. The next plague would not be a silent corruption. It would crawl from the defiled river, a living, croaking, hopping invasion, a testament to a pharaoh's hardened heart and the inexorable advance of a power he could not comprehend. Part 2. The death of the firstborn, a final terrible sacrifice. Before we step into the midnight terror of the final judgment, we must first walk through the ruins of the world it was about to enter. To comprehend the crushing finality of the 10th plague, we must first stand amidst the wreckage of the preceding 9. This was not a final blow against a healthy and defiant titan. It was a coup de grace delivered to an empire that was already bleeding, broken, and gasping for breath. The Egypt that awaited the destroyer was a nation already on its knees. Let us begin with the foundation of all Egyptian life, its economy, an intricate machine powered by the bounty of the Nile. After 9 plagues, this machine was not just sputtering, it was a wreck. The first plague, the turning of the Nile to blood, was more than a week-long horror. It was a permanent ecological shock. The fishing industry, a primary source of food for the common people, was annihilated. The complex web of trade and transport that relied on the great river was paralyzed. The stench of death that clung to the river for weeks would have tainted the very reeds used for papyrus and the clay used for pottery. The artery of the empire had been poisoned at its source, and the venom was still working its way through the system. Then came the 5th plague, the death of the livestock. This was an economic catastrophe of staggering proportions. Imagine, in a single day, watching the nation's primary source of wealth and power collapse in the fields. The sacred cattle, revered as manifestations of the goddess Hathor and the bull god Apis, died where they stood. They were a source of meat, milk, leather, and most importantly agricultural labor. Without oxen to pull the plows, the next planting season was already in jeopardy. The horses, the pride of the Egyptian military, the engines of Pharaoh's feared chariot corps, also perished. The nation was not just impoverished, it was disarmed, its military advantage crippled. The asses and camels, vital for overland trade and transport, fell alongside them. The wealth of Egypt, so often measured in herds and flocks, was wiped out, leaving the nation economically destitute and militarily vulnerable. What little agricultural hope remained was then subjected to a devastating 1-2 punch from the heavens. The 7th plague brought a storm of supernatural fury. A tempest of hail, a phenomenon utterly alien to the Egyptian climate, rained down from the sky. But this was no ordinary hailstorm. The scripture says it was mingled with fire, a terrifying combination of elemental opposites. It shattered everything it touched. The hail decimated the early crops, the flax and the barley. The flax harvest, essential for producing the linen that clothed the entire nation from the king to the commoner, was destroyed. The barley harvest, a staple food and the primary grain for brewing the nation's beer, was beaten into the mud. The storm shattered trees, destroyed what remained of the uncovered chariots, and killed any man or beast unfortunate enough to be caught in the open. The land looked as if it had been through a war. And then, after the fire and ice, came the devouring tide. The 8th plague. A wind from the east brought a locust swarm of a density and scale that defied imagination. The Bible describes them covering the face of the whole earth, so that the land was darkened. This was not a natural swarm. It was a living, breathing, chitinous blanket of hunger. They descended upon the fields and consumed what the hail had spared. The late blooming crops of wheat and spelt, every green thing that had survived the storm, every leaf on every tree, every blade of grass was devoured. When the locusts were finally driven into the sea, they left behind a nation stripped bare. The vibrant, life-giving green of the Nile Valley was gone, replaced by an endless, monotonous vista of brown earth and naked branches. So this is the economic state of Egypt. Its river is tainted, its livestock are dead, its crops are gone. The great granaries that were the hallmark of its stability, the source of its imperial power, are now holding the last vestiges of a bygone era. Famine is not a threat. It is an imminent reality. The most prosperous nation in the ancient world has been reduced to a state of utter destitution. Beyond the economic ruin, consider the physical and psychological state of the Egyptian people. They are a populace traumatized and afflicted. The sixth plague, the boils, was an intensely personal torment. An invisible scourge of fine ash had been thrown into the air before Pharaoh, and it had settled on the skin of every Egyptian, erupting into agonizing sores. This plague was a great equalizer. The high priest in his purified temple, and the quarry slave in his squalor were afflicted with the same painful, festering boils. It was a plague of constant, inescapable pain and ritual uncleanliness, a physical reminder of their collective helplessness. The magicians who had tried to stand against Moses could not even stand at all, their bodies racked with the same affliction they were powerless to prevent. And then came the ninth plague, the immediate precursor to the final blow. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. For 3 days, the land of Egypt was plunged into a darkness so profound, so absolute, that the scripture describes it as a darkness which may be felt. This was not a simple eclipse or a sandstorm. It was a tangible malevolence, a supernatural negation of light and life. It was as if the primordial chaos, the state of non-existence that the Egyptians called Isfet, had been allowed to seep back into the ordered world. For 3 days the sun, the embodiment of their chief god Ra, did not rise. For 3 days no fire could be lit, no torch could pierce the oppressive gloom. Imagine the terror. The world was reduced to the space one could touch. Families were trapped in their homes, unable to see the faces of their loved ones sitting inches away. The silence would have been profound, broken only by the sounds of panicked breathing or weeping in the blackness. It was a form of mass solitary confinement, a claustrophobic horror that isolates each person in their own private prison of fear. For a people who worshipped the sun, this was the ultimate terror. Their god was dead, and the universe was unraveling. And while they stumbled in this velvet coffin of a world, the Hebrews in their homes in Goshen had light. The distinction was absolute, a final terrifying lesson in divine favoritism. This leads us to the most profound wreckage of all, the spiritual collapse. The plagues were not random acts of destruction. They were a systematic, public dismantling of the Egyptian pantheon. The faith that had sustained the civilization for 2 millennia was now in ruins. The gods had been challenged and they had failed. Happy, the god of the Nile's flood, could not prevent his waters from turning to blood. Osiris, whose bloodstream the Nile was meant to be, was shown to be a fiction. Hathor, the cow goddess, could not save her sacred herds. Nut, the goddess of the sky, was powerless to stop the hail from falling from her own body. Set, the god of storms, was impotent against the divinely sent tempest. And in the final analysis, Ra, the king of the gods, the all-powerful sun, had been snuffed out like a candle. His daily victory over the chaos serpent Apep had been rendered moot. A greater power had simply turned him off. The entire religious structure, with its thousands of priests, its elaborate rituals, and its magnificent temples, had been proven utterly useless. The hymns went unanswered. The sacrifices were pointless. The amulets and incantations offered no protection. The gods of Egypt were silent, defeated, and exposed as hollow idols. And at the center of this theological vacuum stood the pharaoh, the living Horus, the son of Ra, the sole guarantor of Maat. His entire identity, his every claim to power, was based on his ability to maintain the divine order. The 9 plagues were a sequential, public, and humiliating testament to his complete failure. The cosmic order had not just been disturbed, it had been systematically violated, and he was powerless to stop it. He was not the intermediary of the gods. He was the focal point of their defeat. He was not a god on earth. He was a man presiding over the corpse of his nation. It is in this context of utter desolation that the final confrontation before the last plague takes place. The 3 days of palpable darkness have just lifted. The sun has returned, but it shines down on a broken, terrified nation. Pharaoh, his own psyche undoubtedly scarred by the experience, summons Moses and Aaron. He is no longer the arrogant monarch of the first encounter. He is a desperate man trying to find a way out. He offers a concession, a final attempt to bargain with the power that has crushed him. "Go serve the Lord," he says, his voice likely strained with exhaustion and fear. But then the old pride flickers. "Only let your flocks and your herds be detained." It is a last pathetic attempt to maintain a sliver of control. He knows the Hebrews' livestock now represents a huge portion of the remaining animal wealth in the land. Perhaps he thinks he can hold it as leverage, or as a form of reparations for the economic damage. He is still trying to negotiate the terms of his own surrender. Moses, however, is no longer the hesitant shepherd who trembled before the burning bush. He is the confident emissary of the God who has just vanquished the Egyptian pantheon. His response is swift and absolute. "There will be no negotiation. You must also give us sacrifices and burnt offerings, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God." He counters, pressing his advantage. "Our livestock also shall go with us. Not a hoof shall be left behind." Not a hoof. The finality of the phrase is like a door slamming shut. It is a declaration of total victory. It tells Pharaoh that he has no power, no leverage, and no say in the matter. Every single animal belongs to the Hebrews and their God, and they will take it all. This utter rejection, this final stripping away of his authority, is too much for Pharaoh's pride to bear. His desperation, his fear, it all curdles back into a final, explosive burst of defiant rage. He has nothing left but his own royal fury. He points a trembling finger at the prophet and spits out his final decree, an ultimatum born not of power but of impotence. "Get away from me," he screams. "Take heed to yourself and see my face no more. For in the day you see my face you shall die." It is the threat of a man who has lost control of everything, now trying to control the space immediately around him. It is the drawing of a final, fatal line in the sand. Moses, calm and resolute in the face of this royal tantrum, accepts the terms. He looks upon the defeated king, a man surrounded by the wreckage of his kingdom and the ghosts of his dead gods, and delivers the chilling final words of their long exchange. "You have spoken well," Moses says, his voice steady and devoid of fear. "I will see your face no more." The dialogue is over. The path of negotiation has reached its end. The 9 warnings have been given and rejected. Pharaoh has made his final choice, sealing his own fate and that of his firstborn son with the threat of death. He has slammed the door on any possibility of mercy. And now, standing in the silence that follows, Moses will open his mouth one last time to deliver not a warning, but a sentence. The stage is perfectly set for the final terrible act. The air in the throne room of Egypt has grown thin and cold. The final words of the king hang in the space between the colossal pillars, a desperate, impotent threat. "In the day you see my face you shall die." It is the last gasp of a failed god, the final roar of a monarch who has lost control of his world and now seeks only to control his immediate vicinity. For months, this chamber had been the stage for a divine drama, a series of confrontations between the will of a king and the word of a prophet. Now that drama has reached its irrevocable conclusion. The dialogue is over. Moses, the once hesitant shepherd, stands before the throne, unmoved by the royal death sentence. He is cloaked in an authority that does not emanate from any earthly power. He does not flinch. He does not flee. He simply accepts the terms, his calm reply a chilling affirmation of the finality of this moment. You have spoken well. I will see your face no more. But before he turns to leave forever, he has one last pronouncement to make. This is not another warning to be debated or another sign to be replicated by frantic magicians. This is no longer an offer of terms. What Moses delivers now is a verdict. It is the reading of a divine sentence that has already been passed in a higher court, a sentence for which there is no appeal. He opens his mouth, and what emerges is not his own voice, but the unmediated, terrifyingly clear voice of judgment. Thus says Yahweh. He begins, and the very name of the Hebrew God now lands with the weight of 9 preceding calamities. About midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt. Let us pause and deconstruct the chilling architecture of this opening statement. The timing. About midnight. This is not a vague, unspecified future. It is a precise appointment with terror. Midnight is the pivot of the day, the deepest point of darkness, the hour when the world is at its most still and vulnerable. It is the time when nightmares feel most real, when the boundary between the waking world and the world of spirits feels at its thinnest. To name this hour is to infuse the prophecy with a dreadful ticking clock. And then the agent of the judgment. The prophecy is spoken in the first person singular. I will go out. This is perhaps the most terrifying phrase of all. The preceding plagues could be seen as acts of nature weaponized, of divine power delegated to the elements or to lesser beings. But this final act is different. This is a personal visitation. The God who had until now remained unseen, whose power was mediated through a prophet and his staff, declares that he himself will now walk the land of Egypt. This is not a judgment carried out by an angel or a storm. It is an intimate, personal execution carried out by the author of life itself. The Creator will become the uncreator, passing through the homes of his defiant creatures. With the time and the agent established, the prophecy then unfolds to reveal the nature of the verdict. And its nature is one of absolute, horrifying precision. And all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. Moses declares, his words falling like stones into the horrified silence of the court. All the firstborn. In the ancient world, and especially in Egypt, the firstborn son, the Bechor, was everything. He was the vessel of the family's future, the primary heir to its property, its status, and its name. He was the one who would carry on the ancestral rites, ensuring his parents' spirits were provided for in the afterlife. He was the embodiment of a family's strength, its continuity, its very hope for immortality. To lose a firstborn was not merely to lose a child. It was to have the branch of the family tree that led to the future violently hacked off. And the prophecy, with chilling clarity, details the universal scope of this sentence, demonstrating that it will be a great and terrible equalizer, utterly contemptuous of the rigid social strata that defined Egyptian life. It begins at the absolute summit of the pyramid of power. From the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne. This is a direct strike at the heart of the Egyptian state and its theology. This is not just Pharaoh's son. This is the crown prince, the heir to the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. This is the child who, from the moment of his birth, was groomed to be the next living incarnation of the god Horus. His life was a guarantee of the nation's divine stability, the next link in an unbroken chain of god-kings. To target him was to target the very concept of the Egyptian monarchy. It was a declaration that Pharaoh's divine lineage was no protection, that his son, the heir to godhood, was as mortal and as vulnerable as any other. It was a message that the future of Pharaoh's dynasty was now forfeit. From that pinnacle of power, the prophecy's gaze sweeps downwards, sparing no one. Even to the firstborn of the female servant who is behind the handmill. Herein lies the terrifying democracy of the judgment. From the throne room to the servants' quarters. Let us paint a picture of this woman. She is at the absolute bottom of the social ladder. She is a slave, perhaps a captive of war or born into her station. Her life is one of endless, backbreaking toil, spending her days and nights turning the heavy stone wheels of the handmill to grind grain for her master's bread. She is anonymous. She is powerless. She owns nothing. Her firstborn son is her only legacy, her only flicker of hope in a life of darkness, the only person who carries her blood into the next generation. And the prophecy declares that the same divine force that will visit the royal bedchamber and claim the heir to the throne will also pass through her squalid corner and claim her son. This detail is a devastating theological statement. It demonstrates that this judgment is not based on sin or status, wealth or power. It is based on a single defining identity, being Egyptian. In the eyes of this judgment, the son of the king and the son of the slave girl are exactly the same. They are both the firstborn of the nation that has held God's people in bondage. It renders the complex hierarchies of the Egyptian world utterly meaningless. And the scope of the judgment does not stop at the human threshold. It bleeds out into the natural world, a cosmic sentence against the principle of primacy itself. And all the firstborn of the beasts. We must remember that the fifth plague had already destroyed the livestock in the fields. This new threat likely targeted the animals that had been sheltered indoors, or perhaps those born since the previous plague. But its purpose was no longer primarily economic. It was theological. The firstborn calf of the sacred Apis bull, worshipped in Memphis as the living god, would die. The firstborn ram, sacred to the god Ammonius, would perish. The firstborn of the horses that remained, the very symbol of military might, would fall. This extension of the plague to the animal kingdom demonstrated that this was not merely a human tragedy, but a judgment against the entire Egyptian cosmos. The principle of the firstborn, a concept of primacy and special status, was being overturned throughout all of creation within the borders of Egypt. Having detailed the victims, Moses then pronounces the inevitable consequence. He describes the sound that this night of silent death will produce. Then there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as has never been before, nor shall be again. A great cry, a nationwide, universal wail of grief. He is prophesying a moment of such profound and collective sorrow that it will be unparalleled in the long and storied history of the Egyptian people. It will be a sound worse than the cries of a battlefield, worse than the mourning for a dead king, because it will emanate from every single house. It will be the sound of a nation's heart being ripped from its chest in a single synchronized moment of loss. And then, in the midst of this prophecy of utter devastation, Moses paints a contrasting picture of profound and miraculous peace. The judgment, he explains, will be surgical in its precision. But against any of the children of Israel, he declares, his voice cutting through the atmosphere of doom, not a dog shall move its tongue against man or beast. The specificity of this image is stunning. Not just that the Israelites would be safe, but that their entire environment would be unnaturally, supernaturally tranquil. Not even a dog would bark. The dog, the ever-present scavenger and guardian of the ancient world, a creature prone to barking at any nighttime disturbance, would be divinely silenced. This meant the destroyer would pass through their villages so seamlessly, so perfectly distinguishing its targets, that nothing would be disturbed. There would be no panic, no collateral damage, no sound of alarm. The homes of the slaves would be oases of impossible serenity in the midst of a hurricane of grief. The purpose of this stark and miraculous distinction is then laid bare. It is the final lesson in the divine curriculum that began with Pharaoh's arrogant question, "Who is Yahweh?" Moses concludes, "That you may know that Yahweh does make a difference between the Egyptians and Israel." This is the thesis statement for the entire saga. The plagues were not just punishments, they were educational. They were a series of brutal lessons designed to answer that first question. And this final terrible plague would be the undeniable answer. When every Egyptian household is mourning their firstborn and every Hebrew household is untouched, the difference would be known. It would be known by Pharaoh, by the Egyptians, and crucially by the Israelites themselves, who needed to understand the power and the particular love of the God who was redeeming them. Having delivered this devastating verdict, the scripture tells us that Moses turned and left the Pharaoh's presence in great anger. This is a profound and telling detail. This is not the petty anger of a man who has been insulted. This is the righteous, holy fury of a prophet who has spent months pleading, warning, and demonstrating, only to be met with a stubborn pride that has now doomed an entire nation. It is the anger of seeing mercy offered 9 times and rejected 9 times. It is the grief-filled rage of a man who knows the terrible, needless suffering that the king's arrogance is about to unleash upon his own people. His anger is the final emotional punctuation mark on the entire exchange. The time for patience is over. The time for sorrowful judgment has come. He walks out of the throne room, leaving Pharaoh alone in the sudden, terrible silence. The king is trapped. He has heard the sentence. He has been told the time, the victims, the consequences, and the reason. The prophet who has been his tormentor for months is gone, never to return. There is nothing left to do. There is no one left to threaten. All that remains is for Pharaoh, and for all of Egypt, to wait for the sun to set, and for the clock to tick toward midnight. The prophecy of the final terrible plague now hung over the land of Egypt like a shroud. In the palaces and corridors of power, Pharaoh and his court were left to grapple with a dread unlike any they had ever known, a specific, dated appointment with national devastation. But while the Egyptians waited in a state of passive terror for the midnight hour, a very different kind of activity was beginning to stir in the mud-brick slave quarters of Goshen. For the Hebrew people, this night was not to be one of cowering in fear, hoping the coming storm would pass them by. They were not to be passive beneficiaries of a divine act. They were being called to be active, willing participants in their own redemption. Their survival depended not on their ethnicity alone, but on an act of collective, radical obedience. As the sentence of death was being pronounced upon Egypt, a covenant of life was being offered to Israel. The instructions for this covenant, delivered by Moses and Aaron, were meticulous, specific, and freighted with layers of profound symbolic meaning. This was the institution of the Passover, or Pesach in Hebrew, a ritual that would not only shield them from the coming wrath, but would also serve as the foundational, defining event of their national identity for all time. The divine protocol for survival began with the commandment of selection. On the 10th day of the month, which would later be known as Nisan, a full 4 days before the plague was to strike, each household was to select a lamb. This was not to be a random choice. The criteria were strict and absolute. "Your lamb shall be without blemish," the command stated, "a male of the first year." Let us unpack the significance of this requirement. Without blemish in Hebrew, tamim. This meant it had to be perfect. It could have no spots, no diseases, no scars, no broken bones. It had to be the healthiest, most physically perfect specimen from the flock. This was not a command to cull the weakest animal. It was a demand for the best. This signified that the life being offered as a substitute was one of high value, a pure and worthy sacrifice. It was to be a male, a symbol of strength, headship, and covenant representation, and of the first year, meaning it was in the prime of its young life, full of vigor and potential. This was a costly sacrifice, a tangible giving up of a valuable asset, a life in its prime offered in place of another life in its prime. The instructions then added a psychologically powerful element. For 4 days, from the 10th to the 14th of the month, this perfect lamb was to be brought into the family's home. It was to live with them. Imagine the scene in these small, crowded dwellings. This young animal, destined for slaughter, would become a temporary and intimate part of the family circle. The children would feed it, play with it, perhaps even give it a name. An attachment, a bond would inevitably be formed. This was not an impersonal, abstract sacrifice. The command ensured that when the moment of slaughter came, it would be a personal, poignant, and deeply felt loss. They would know the specific life that was being given for their own. Then came the moment of the ritual slaughter. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. The timing, at twilight, or literally between the two evenings, placed the event at the cusp of day and night, a transitional time fitting for a transitional event. And this was not to be an individual act done in secret. It was a synchronized community-wide ordinance. At the same hour throughout the land of Goshen, a wave of ritual slaughter would take place. The unity of the action was crucial. It bound the individual households together, transforming them from a collection of families into a single consecrated congregation, a unified people acting on a single command. Each family was performing the same rite, cementing a shared identity forged in a shared act of obedience. But the most vital instruction, the very hinge upon which their survival would turn, concerned what to do with the blood. The lifeblood of the innocent lamb was not to be simply poured onto the ground and forgotten. It was to be carefully collected in a basin. Then the instructions specified, "They shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it." Using a bunch of hyssop, a common, bushy herb that was often used in rituals of purification from diseases like leprosy or contact with the dead, the head of each household was to act as a priest for his own family. He was to dip the hyssop into the basin of blood and paint it onto the frame of the front door. A streak of crimson on the vertical post to the left, a streak on the vertical post to the right, and a final streak across the horizontal beam overhead. The entrance to their home, the threshold that separated the private, protected space within from the chaos and judgment that would soon engulf the world without, was to be marked, sealed by this sign of blood. Let us be clear about what this act represented. This was not a superstitious charm, not a magical sigil designed to repel a mindless demon. The text makes it clear that the destroyer was an intelligent force acting on divine orders. The blood was a sign, an outward symbol of an inward reality. It was a public and nonverbal declaration of faith. By applying the blood, the Israelites were saying, "We believe the word of Yahweh. We believe the prophecy of judgment. We accept the terms of salvation. We are sheltering under the sign of a life that has been given in place of our own." The blood on the doorframe was a silent, crimson testimony that a death had already occurred at this address. It was the ultimate act of faith, trusting that this sign, this application of a substitute's death, would be their only and all-sufficient shield against the coming terror. With the homes thus marked and consecrated, the divine protocol turned to the meal itself. This was to be no ordinary family dinner. Every element of the meal was prescribed, each one a sensory catechism, a lesson to be eaten. Then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire, with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Roasted in fire. Fire, throughout the scriptures, is a symbol of both divine presence and divine judgment. The flesh of the lamb was to be wholly subjected to the purifying, consuming flame. It was not to be boiled, which would involve the mediating element of water, nor eaten raw, which would be incomplete. It had to pass through the fire, symbolizing the judgment that the lamb was absorbing on behalf of the family. With unleavened bread. For 7 days following this night, the Hebrews were commanded to eat matzah, bread made without leaven or yeast. Before the Passover meal, they were to conduct a thorough search of their homes and purge every last crumb of leaven. Symbolically, leaven, which puffs up and expands, was often used as a metaphor for sin, pride, and corruption, a small amount that can quickly spread and influence the whole lump of dough. Eating unleavened bread was therefore a symbol of purity, humility, and a conscious removal of the old, corrupting influences of Egypt. On a more practical level, it symbolized haste. Leavened bread takes time to rise. There would be no such time. Their departure from Egypt would be sudden and swift. This bread was the food of fugitives, the nourishment of a people on the move, leaving the puffed-up pride and bondage of Egypt behind. And with bitter herbs. In Hebrew Mer, the family would eat sharp, bitter plants like chicory, endive, or horseradish. This was a deliberate act of sensory memory. With every sharp, eye-watering bite, they were to physically re-experience the bitterness of their 400 years of slavery. It was a tangible reminder of the lash of the taskmaster's whip, the bitterness of their servitude, the tears of their children, and the crushing hopelessness from which they were being redeemed. The meal was thus perfectly balanced. The bitterness of the past, herbs, alongside the purity of their new beginning, unleavened bread. All made possible by the sacrifice of the innocent, the lamb. Finally, the very manner in which they were to consume this sacred meal was mandated. This was not to be a leisurely, relaxed dinner. And thus you shall eat it, with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. So you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. They were to eat fully dressed and ready for a journey. The long flowing robes of the era were to be girded up with a belt for freedom of movement. Their sandals, normally removed inside the home, were to be strapped to their feet. Their traveler's staff, their tool for the long walk through the wilderness, was to be in their hand. They were to eat as soldiers awaiting marching orders, as refugees poised for flight at a moment's notice. This posture was a profound act of expectant faith. They were preparing for a journey that had not yet begun, based solely on a promise. They were dressing for freedom, while still surrounded by the nation that enslaved them. They were holding their walking sticks while the doors were still barred. It was a physical enactment of their belief that the chains of bondage were about to be broken forever. As the sun set on the 14th day of the month, a strange and sacred atmosphere settled over the land of Goshen. The final preparations were complete. The lamb had been slain. The blood had been applied. The meal was being consumed in haste, in silence, in solemn expectation. Every family, sealed within its own small sanctuary, was united in this shared, secret ritual. They had done all that they had been commanded to do. Now there was nothing left but to wait in the darkness, their ears straining for the first sign of the passing of the destroyer, their hearts suspended between the bitter memory of slavery and the awesome, terrifying hope of freedom. They had put their faith in the lamb and the blood. They were about to find out if it was enough. The sun has long since vanished beyond the western horizon. A deep starless blackness has settled over the Nile Valley, a darkness that feels different from the supernatural gloom of the ninth plague. This is a natural darkness, yet it is pregnant with an unnatural tension. A profound and watchful silence hangs over the land. It is the charged silence of a world holding its breath, waiting for a sentence to be carried out. It is the calm at the absolute center of the storm. Let us imagine ourselves in that silence, moving between two vastly different realities coexisting side by side in the same night. First, let us enter the homes of the Egyptians. In the grand palaces of Memphis and Thebes, in the comfortable villas of the nobles and priests, in the cramped, mud-brick tenements of the artisans and laborers, no one is truly asleep. The prophecy delivered by Moses echoes in every mind. About midnight, every Egyptian, from the highest vizier to the lowest field hand, has a firstborn, a son, a brother, a father, a husband, and every one of them is now a potential target. They lie on their sleeping mats, their eyes wide open in the darkness, staring at the unseen ceiling. Every familiar night sound the settling of the house, the cry of a distant jackal, the rustle of the windies magnified, twisted by fear into a portent of doom. Fathers and mothers find themselves rising, creeping silently to the doorways of their children's rooms. They stand there, listening to the soft rhythmic sound of their firstborn son's breathing, a sound they have heard 1,000 times before, but one that tonight seems fragile, precious, and terribly vulnerable. They ask themselves, was it all a bluff? A madman's threat? The raving of a fanatical leader of slaves? They cling to this hope, for the alternative is too monstrous to contemplate. Yet the memory of the 9 preceding calamities, the blood, the boils, the darknesses, a cold weight in the pit of their stomachs, whispering that this God does what he says he will do. And so they wait, prisoners of a prophecy, suspended in a state of agonizing uncertainty. Now let us shift our perspective to the land of Goshen. Here, too, there is a profound silence, but it is of a different quality. It is not the silence of dread, but of solemn sacred expectation. Behind the doors conspicuously marked with the fresh, crimson blood of the Passover lamb, the Hebrew families are huddled together. The ritual meal has been consumed in haste. The remains of the lamb, as commanded, have been burned completely, leaving no trace. The final, critical instruction now governs their actions. None of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning. They are sealed within these small domestic arks of salvation. The blood-stained door is their only shield. To step outside that threshold would be to step out from under the protection of the sacrifice and into the path of the judgment. So they wait. The children, perhaps sensing the immense gravity of the night, are quiet. The parents listen, their hearts pounding in their chests. They are listening not for what might happen to them, but for the signs of what is happening to the world outside, a world that has been their prison for 400 years. They wait for the sound of their liberation, a sound they know will be born of their oppressor's grief. The hour of midnight arrives. The scripture says, "And it came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt." It is as simple and as stark as that. There is no accompanying earthquake, no clap of thunder, no rushing wind. The destroyer, the agent of divine judgment, moves through the land with the silence that is more terrifying than any sound. It is an invisible, unstoppable, and utterly discerning presence. It needs no key to enter a locked home. It passes through walls and bolted doors as if they were not there. It needs no sword, for this is not a physical assault. It is an act of uncreation, a divine revocation of the gift of life. The wave of death begins as prophesied at the apex of power. In the opulent royal palace, where armed guards patrol the corridors and every entrance is sealed, the destroyer passes into the bedchamber of the crown prince, the heir to the throne of the mighty Egyptian empire, the future god-king, the boy who represented the eternal continuity of his father's divine dynasty, simply ceases to be. His breath stops. His heart falls silent. The future of Egypt dies without a sound. And from there the silent wave spreads outward, permeating every corner of the land. It moves through the sprawling villas of the nobles, men whose wealth and status could buy them anything but protection on this night. In one room, a young man who was to inherit vast tracts of land and a fleet of trading ships takes his last breath. In another, the eldest son of a high priest of Ammoniusare, a boy destined for a life of immense religious power, is claimed. The destroyer sweeps through the military garrisons. The firstborn sons of the generals and the chariot commanders, the strong young men who form the future leadership of the world's most feared army, perish in their barracks. It moves down, ever downward through the intricate social strata. It finds the homes of the merchants, the scribes, the artisans. A weaver's son, a potter's son, a stonemason's son. Each family in its own small world had its own prince, its own heir, its own hope for the future. And in each home that hope is extinguished. And as promised, the judgment reaches the very bottom. It finds the hovels of the indentured servants and the state-owned slaves. It passes through the squalid room behind the handmills, where the slave girl lies beside her son. For her, he was not an heir to property, but perhaps her only connection to joy, her only reason for survival. And in an instant he too is gone. The judgment, in its terrible impartiality, has united the queen and the servant girl in a single shared sorrow. The sentence passed on the beasts is carried out with the same silent efficiency. Throughout the land, in stalls and pens, the firstborn of the livestock collapse. The sacred Apis bull, a god in its own right, falls dead in its hallowed temple enclosure, its priests left to stare in horror at the failed divinity. And all the while in Goshen the destroyer sees the sign. As the invisible presence approaches a Hebrew doorway, it sees the crimson mark of the blood of the Lamb. It recognizes this as the sign of a substitute, the evidence that a death has already taken place here, that a life has been offered and accepted. And the judgment passes over. This is the literal meaning of Pesach. It is a stepping over, a sparing, a divine exemption. Inside these homes, life continues undisturbed. The children sleep soundly. The parents listen to the silence, unaware of the precise moment their salvation has been secured. As promised, not a single dog barks. The peace is absolute, miraculous, and a stark contrast to the devastation unfolding just beyond their walls. The silence of the judgment, however, is destined to be short-lived. It is merely the prelude to the consequence. Somewhere in the royal palace, a servant or the queen herself enters the prince's chamber and finds the still, cold body. A single sound shatters the midnight silence. It is not a word. It is a raw, primal scream of a mother's grief, a sound of pure, uncomprehending agony. That first scream is a spark in a tinderbox of sorrow. A moment later, a similar cry erupts from a nearby nobleman's villa, and then another from the house across the street, and then another and another and another. The individual cries begin to multiply, to overlap, to merge. They swell from a handful of voices into a chorus, from a chorus into a roar. The sound spills out from the houses into the streets, from the cities into the countryside. It becomes a single vast nationwide wail, the sound of millions of hearts breaking at once. And Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians. And there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. This is the great cry that Moses foretold. The singular sound of a nation's soul being torn apart. Imagine that sound. It is a cacophony of grief, terror, and despair. Fathers are weeping, mothers are shrieking, siblings are crying out in disbelief. The carefully constructed order of Egyptian society has completely collapsed into a universal democracy of pain. There is no comfort, no solace, because every neighbor, every friend, every family up and down the river is suffering the exact same loss. There is no one to turn to for consolation, for everyone is inconsolable. This is not a plague that can be endured or waited out. This is not a financial loss or a physical ailment. This is a wound cut into the very heart of every family. It is a grief that will never heal, a loss that will define the rest of their lives. The silence of midnight has been replaced by a deafening roar of sorrow, the final terrible price for a king's hardened heart. The judgment is complete. The great cry that tore through the Egyptian night was more than just the collective sound of human sorrow. It was an audible death rattle. It was the sound of a worldview collapsing, of a theological system being publicly executed alongside the nation's sons. The 10th plague was not merely the most tragic and painful of the 10. It was the theological checkmate, the final unanswerable move in a divine war that had been waged for months. Each of the preceding plagues had been a targeted strike against a specific aspect of the Egyptian pantheon. The death of the firstborn was the capstone, the all-encompassing blow that fulfilled the explicit, terrifying promise made by Yahweh to Moses. Against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. To understand the depth of this theological victory, we must see this final plague not as a single act, but as a multi-layered assault that dismantled the core tenets of Egyptian faith and power with a terrifying surgical precision. The most immediate and devastating target was, of course, the divinity of Pharaoh himself. Throughout this series we have emphasized that the Pharaoh was not a mere king. He was the linchpin of the entire cosmic order. In the state theology, he was the living incarnation of the falcon god Horus, the son of the creator god Ra, and the sole effective intermediary between humanity and the entire pantheon. His power was absolute precisely because it was believed to be divine. His health ensured the nation's health. His authority guaranteed the rising of the sun and the flooding of the Nile. The life of his firstborn son was the tangible proof of this divine mandate. The crown prince was not just a political heir. He was the future of that divinity, the next Horus in waiting, the vessel into whom the sacred kingship would be poured upon his father's death. The continuity of the divine dynasty, stretching back in an unbroken chain to the time of the gods, was the ultimate testament to the stability of Ma'at, the divine order. And on this night that continuity was severed. The destroyer, in passing through the guarded chambers of the royal palace and extinguishing the life of the heir, delivered a message of catastrophic simplicity: your king is no god. His blood is not sacred. His palace is not protected. His lineage is not divine. He is a man, and he is as powerless to protect his own son as any other man in his broken kingdom. This was not a symbolic defeat, like a staff being eaten by a serpent. This was a personal, visceral, and undeniable refutation of Pharaoh's core identity. Every wail that echoed from the royal chambers was an admission of his failure. He, the living Horus, had been unable to protect the next Horus. He, the son of Ra, had been unable to shield his own son from a power that treated the sun god's grandson with utter contempt. The plague took the abstract concept of Pharaoh's impotence, demonstrated throughout the previous 9 plagues, and made it horrifyingly concrete. It shattered the central pillar of the state religion, leaving Pharaoh exposed not as a god on earth, but as a grieving father, a defeated king, and a failed deity. This leads to the second layer of the theological assault: the judgment on the concept of legacy and the afterlife, a concept governed by the great god Osiris. As we have explored, Osiris was the king of the underworld, the lord of resurrection, and the judge of the dead. The entire elaborate funerary cult of Egypt, the mummification, the tombs, the Book of the Dead, was a system designed to ensure a safe passage into his blessed kingdom. A good death and a proper burial were essential. But what of those claimed by the 10th plague? Theirs was not a good death. It was not a natural passing, nor an honorable death in battle. It was a divine execution, a life extinguished by the direct sentence of a rival god. This raised a terrifying theological question for the Egyptians. Can a soul slain by the judgment of Yahweh even stand before the judgment of Osiris? Does the god of the Egyptian underworld have any claim over a soul harvested by the God of the Hebrews? The plague threw their entire soteriology, their doctrine of salvation, into chaos. It suggested that their meticulously planned path to eternal life could be short-circuited by a power that operated outside of and superior to their own system. The silent death of the firstborn cast a long, cold shadow over the gilded promises of the Osirian afterlife. The third layer was a direct assault on the gods and goddesses of family, birth, and protection. Egyptian households were filled with amulets and idols dedicated to deities who were supposed to safeguard the family, particularly children. Chief among these was Isis, the great mother goddess. Her fame, her power, her very identity was inextricably linked to her role as a fierce and cunning protector of her own son, Horus, from the murderous intentions of his uncle Set. She was the divine archetype of a loving, powerful mother who would stop at nothing to keep her child safe. Every Egyptian mother would have prayed to her, invoking her legendary protective powers. On this night, Isis was proven to be utterly silent and impotent. Her defining myth was exposed as a powerless story. She, who hid her son in the papyrus swamps to save him, could not save a single firstborn son in all of Egypt. The great mother goddess was shown to be incapable of protecting the nation's children, her reputation shattered in a million grieving households. Similarly, there was Bes, the popular grotesque dwarf god. His image was everywhere in the Egyptian home. He was a household guardian, a jester for the gods who used his fearsome appearance and loud noises to frighten away evil spirits, particularly those that threatened mothers in childbirth and young children. He was the divine bouncer, the spiritual security guard for the family. On the night of the Passover, every single amulet of Bes, Every carving on every bed frame, every statue in every corner, proved to be nothing more than a useless piece of clay or wood. The guardian god failed in his one essential task in every single home all at once. And what of the gods of fertility and life itself? Min, the god of male virility, and Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth and fertility, were central to the hope of continuing a family line. The 10th plague was a direct mockery of their domains. It was a statement that the power to grant life was meaningless in the face of a superior power to take it away. The future that these gods promised was cancelled in a single night. The final layer of judgment was perhaps the most profound. It was the execution of a perfect, terrifying, symmetrical justice. It was the principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth applied on a cosmic scale. The entire saga of the Exodus did not begin with the plagues. It began generations earlier, with the decree of a previous pharaoh. Fearing the growing numbers of the Hebrews, that pharaoh had commanded, "Every son who is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile." He had ordered the systematic murder of an entire generation of firstborn Hebrew sons. He began the cycle of violence. He targeted the children. The God of the Hebrews had not forgotten this foundational crime. The memory of those infants, drowned in the sacred river of the Egyptians, had been preserved. And now the debt had come due. In the book of Exodus, chapter 4, long before the first plague was even unleashed, God gave Moses a message that framed the entire coming conflict. He was to say to Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me. But if you refuse to let him go, indeed I will kill your son, your firstborn." The terms had been set from the very beginning. God had designated the entire nation of Israel as his firstborn son. By enslaving and brutalizing this nation, Pharaoh was committing an offense against the firstborn of Yahweh. The conflict was framed as a battle between two fathers over their sons. Pharaoh had refused to release God's son, so God, after 9 escalating warnings, finally claimed Pharaoh's son in return. This was not random, wanton cruelty. In the legal and theological framework of the ancient Near East, this was a terrifyingly just and symmetrical retribution. It was a divine receipt for a debt of blood that had been outstanding for generations. The great cry of the Egyptians in the night was a terrible echo of the silent cries of the Hebrew mothers, whose sons had been taken from them and given to the Nile. The judgment was not just a display of power, it was a balancing of the scales. Thus, the 10th plague brought all the theological threads together. It dethroned Pharaoh, invalidated the promises of the afterlife, mocked the protector gods, and served as a final, just settlement for a foundational crime. It was the ultimate answer to Pharaoh's initial arrogant question, "Who is Yahweh?" The answer that now echoed in the wailing of his people was clear. He is the God who judges kings and other gods. He is the God who remembers injustice. He is the God who protects his own children. And he is the God whose power over life and death is absolute. The theological argument was over. The gods of Egypt had been executed. The great cry that had ripped through the Egyptian night was not just a sound of grief. It was the sound of a will being broken. It was the sound of a nation's spirit shattering into a million pieces. And at the epicenter of that shattering stood one man, the Pharaoh. For months his heart had been a fortress of defiance. He had weathered a defiled river, a land crawling with vermin, a nation afflicted with disease, a sky that rained fire, a darkness that could be felt. Through it all, his pride had been his shield, his divine self-conception an impenetrable wall. But this final plague was not a force that could be weathered. It did not strike at his property or his people in the abstract. It had passed through his walls, through his guards, through the very illusion of his power, and it had touched his own flesh and blood. It had taken his son. The heart that had been hardened by pride was now pulverized by grief. The fortress was breached, and the king inside was no longer a god, but simply a broken father. The man who mere hours before had screamed at Moses, "See my face no more, for in the day you see my face you shall die," now found that his greatest, most urgent need was to find the very man he had threatened to kill. The scripture tells us that Pharaoh rose in the night. This was not the stately ceremonial rising of a king greeting the dawn. This was the frantic, panicked scrambling of a man in a waking nightmare. He did not wait for his royal chariot or his attendants. He sent messengers tearing through the wailing streets to find Moses and Aaron. He summoned them to his presence in the dead of night, a complete reversal of all royal protocol, an act of utter desperation. Imagine that final meeting. It does not take place in the grand throne room in a display of power. It is more likely a frantic, shadowed encounter in a palace chamber, the air thick with the smell of funerary incense already being burned and the sound of weeping echoing from down the hall. Pharaoh is no longer the composed, arrogant deity on a gilded throne. He is a man undone, his royal robes perhaps disheveled, his face a mask of terror and unbearable sorrow. The power dynamic, which had been eroding for months, has now completely inverted. Moses and Aaron, the humble messengers of a slave god, are now the figures of authority. Pharaoh, the supposed master of the world, is now the supplicant. And from his lips pours a torrent of unconditional surrender. There is no more bargaining, no more negotiation, no more attempts to save face. There is only a desperate, panicked plea to be rid of the source of his torment. "Rise, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel," he gasps, the words tumbling out of him. "And go, serve the Lord as you have said." This is a full and complete capitulation to the original demand, the very words he had scornfully rejected months before. He then addresses the last point of contention, the final bargaining chip he had tried to play. "Also take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone." He relinquishes all claim to their property. The wealth of the Hebrews, their vast herds which now represented a significant portion of the remaining livestock in Egypt, is theirs to take. All leverage is abandoned. He understands now that he is not in a position to make demands. And then comes the final, most pathetic and revealing plea of all. After surrendering everything, after conceding total defeat, he looks at the men who have been the architects of his ruin and begs, "And bless me also." Let the weight of those three words sink in. Bless me also. The man who was the living incarnation of Horus, the son of Ra, the high priest of every temple in the land, the source from which all blessings were supposed to flow to his people, now begs for a blessing from a prophet of Yahweh. It is the ultimate admission of spiritual bankruptcy. It is a desperate acknowledgement that his own gods are useless, that his own divine status is a sham, and that the only source of power, the only source of potential relief from this waking nightmare, resides with the God he has so long defied. He is not asking for forgiveness. He is simply begging for the pain to stop. It is the cry of a man who has touched absolute power and has been utterly broken by it. The panic of the king was a mere reflection of the terror that had gripped his people. The great cry of grief was swiftly mingling with a rising tide of primal fear. The Egyptians, in their sorrow, came to a stark realization. The presence of the Hebrews in their land was a mortal danger. These were not just slaves. They were the protected people of a terrifying God who, to save them, was willing to dismantle an entire civilization. The scripture says the Egyptians urged the people that they might send them out of the land in haste. This was not a grudging release, it was a frantic expulsion. The roles were now completely reversed. The masters were begging their former slaves to leave. They pressed upon them, hastening their departure, driven by a simple, chilling fear. For they said, "We shall all be dead." They believed that if the Israelites remained a moment longer, the judgment would continue until not a single Egyptian was left alive. And in this frantic rush to purge the land of the Hebrews, Another prophesied event came to pass. For generations, the Israelites had toiled under the lash, building the treasure cities of Egypt without pay. Their labor had created the very wealth that adorned the temples and palaces of their oppressors. Now, in the chaos of the Exodus, a form of divine reparations was enacted. As Moses had commanded them, the Hebrew women went to their Egyptian neighbors. They did not have to rob or pillage. They simply asked. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they granted them what they requested. Imagine the scene. An Egyptian woman, her eyes red with weeping for her dead son, willingly hands over her silver jewelry, her golden ornaments, the finest clothing in her possession, to the Hebrew woman who lives next door. She does so not out of generosity, but out of a desperate desire to appease the terrifying God who has just visited her home. It was a transfer of wealth born of fear. Take it all, just go. This plundering of the Egyptians was not an act of theft. It was the payment of a long overdue debt. The slaves who had owned nothing were now being laden with the very wealth their centuries of unpaid labor had created. They would not leave their bondage as paupers, sneaking away in the night. They would march out as a victorious people, compensated for their suffering and equipped for their new life by their terrified former masters. And so the great departure began. At the word of command, a torrent of humanity began to stream out of the houses of Goshen. It was a scene of organized chaos, a nation mobilizing in a matter of hours. The scripture states, "So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their clothes on their shoulders." This small domestic detail powerfully captures the haste of the moment. The exodus happened so quickly, there was no time to wait for the bread to rise. The symbol of their haste, the unleavened matzah, was a literal reality of their departure. They were leaving now. The children of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkot, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. While the precise number is a matter of scholarly debate, the image is one of a massive nation-sized migration. This was not a small band of refugees. This was a whole people on the move. And they were not alone. A mixed multitude went up with them also. Other slaves, other Semitic peoples, perhaps even some disaffected Egyptians who had witnessed the power of Yahweh and lost all faith in their own gods, cast their lot with the Hebrews. They joined the Exodus, swelling the ranks of this new nation being born in the crucible of judgment. They marched out with their flocks and herds, a vast collection of animal life, and with the gold and silver of Egypt in their hands. They marched past the homes of their former masters, homes that were now filled with the sounds of weeping. They marched out under the very eyes of the Egyptians, not as fugitives, but as a liberated army walking away from a defeated foe. This was the shattering. A king was broken. A nation was terrified. A people were liberated. An empire was plundered. The 10th plague had not just killed the firstborn. It had shattered the will of a king, broken the back of an empire, and redrawn the map of the human soul. As the massive column of former slaves walked away from the land of pyramids and into the vast, unknown wilderness, they were guided not by a human map, but by a divine presencia, pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Their chains were broken, but the great cry of Egypt would echo in their history forever, a terrible and constant reminder of the price of their freedom, and the awesome, terrifying power of the God who had passed over them to set them free. Thank you for joining us for this conclusion to our exploration of the Egyptian plagues. The story of the death of the firstborn is a difficult and sobering one, a profound meditation on justice, defiance, sacrifice, and the birth of a nation. It remains one of the most powerful and consequential narratives in human history. If you found this deep dive into the past to be of value, please consider supporting the Eldritch Codex. Like this video, subscribe to our channel for more explorations of history's most profound and mysterious events, and be sure to activate the bell of notification to be alerted to our future releases. Our immense gratitude goes out to our patrons, whose generosity and support are the bedrock upon which this channel is built. If you wish to join our community of supporters, you can find the link in the description below. Until next time, may you continue to seek the wisdom hidden within the great stories of our past. Look into the darkness, and do not be afraid of the truths you find there.